Okay guys, to do the next two notebook samples, you're gonna use this updated pattern to cut out your swatches. So we have a pattern piece here. It's the front bodice. Imagine it being cut on the fold, and this is the neckline, this is the shoulder and the armhole side seams. So you're gonna cut out two of them on self fabric. So that's just the outer fabric of, if this is a blouse, like what the outer fabric would be. We're gonna use the same pattern to also cut one out of lining fabric, okay? And then we have another pattern piece over here, and this is called a facing. This is the name of this type of pattern piece. And we're gonna use this to also cut it out of the same fabric that you use to cut the lining out of. We'll use this pattern piece, and that will be our facing. So when you're done, you'll have 4 pattern pieces cut out of fabric. We only need to cut 2 out of this paper. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut those out now. Okay, so I have some fabric here. This is my self fabric, this blue fabric, and I'm gonna be using this gray fabric for the lining and the facing pieces. So this pattern does need to be cut on the fold. Okay, so I wanna fold my fabric. And I need 2 of the self, so I have 2 folded, ready to go. And I'm just gonna line up the pattern piece against the fold and throw in some pins and go ahead and cut it out. Okay, so for my lining fabric, I'm gonna go ahead and fold it because this pattern is also cut on the fold. And then I'm also gonna use this fabric to cut out the facing as well, and that also needs to be cut on the fold. Okay, to start this notebook sample, this is actually 2 samples. You're going to understitch both of them. So the first one, I'm gonna set the facing and one of the self bodices aside, and I'm gonna start with just the self bodice and the lining. And we're gonna sew it together around the front neckline. So to sew it, you would place right sides together and go ahead and sew the neck opening. Now, if you look up other tutorials, some people will sew with like 1/2 inch seam allowance and then they'll trim it down to 1/4 inch. Some people just think it's easier just to sew it at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think I'm gonna go with that, and I'm gonna go ahead and sew it at 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that way I don't have to trim it after I'm done. So to get started, I'll put in my pins, and then I'm gonna take it to the sewing machine, and I'm gonna sew this guy with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I sewed the 2 pieces together. I sewed the self printed fabric to the lining, and I sewed it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now normally you would flip it out like this. That's kind of your finished garment, I guess. But because we sewed a curve, every time you sew a curve, you do need to clip the seams. Just memorize it. There's other videos where I explain it in more detail, but today, just memorize it. So I'm gonna clip, oops, there, these are a little, not as sharp as I'd like them, darn it. Okay, be careful not to clip your stitching. Don't wanna do that. Just the seam allowance around the curve. Okay, so now, we are going to do the understitch. At this point, we just sewed a seam. Now to do the understitch. So the understitch is when we press all the lining towards, or not the lining, excuse me, all of the seam allowance towards the lining. And we're gonna stitch in the seam allowance to catch the lining. So you're gonna basically stitch the 2 layers of seam allowance and the 1 layer of line. You are not gonna stitch your bodice shirt, okay? So we're gonna do that around the whole entire neck. It's recommended to sew it with the lining face up, okay? So sometimes what I do is I'll pin it where I can see the seam allowance, and then I might take out my pins and sew it the other way, or pin it the other way. No, I could try just pinning it straight this way. Okay, just want to make sure it's flat. Just what sometimes students do is they accidentally have it kind of bunch up, you know, and pucker. You just really want to make sure it's nice and flat. You want to make sure you're pinning the seam allowances to the lining. Don't forget about them. It's kind of the whole point. Okay. I have my pins at an angle today because the seam allowance is only 1/4 inch. It's not very thick. So that way I can just guarantee that I'm actually pinning it at a diagonal. Okay, so now what I'm going to stitch is really close to the edge. If my seam allowance is 1/4 inch, I might stitch 1/8 inch. Some people like to stitch even closer, like 1/16. I'm gonna shoot for 1/8 inch. And I'm just gonna back stitch and then stitch all the way around to the other end, and of course back stitch when I'm done, catching the seam allowances. Okay, that is the understitch. So I'm gonna go take it to the machine now. Okay, I'm gonna sew the understitch. Here it is. Remember, on the back side, I'm gonna be catching both of the seam allowances to the lining. So here we go. Okay, I'm taking it out of the machine. I'm gonna go ahead and trim my threads. And as you can see, we have a stitch on the lining, no stitch on the actual self fabric. And doing this understitch is actually making it a lot easier to just find, you know, my top opening. It's really folding down nicely. I haven't even ironed it yet. This is gonna look so great when I take it to the iron and give it a press. But there you go. So now when the, you know, customer wears this shirt, she's gonna have a really nice, clean edge finish, no raw edge, no top stitch. And then on the inside, it's fully lined. And we also have our understitch, which is holding down the lining. Okay, so now you're gonna sew an understitch to a facing. So you'll need your self fabric and your facing. And you're gonna do exactly the same thing that you would as the lining. So you're gonna start by sewing right sides together. So I'm gonna line this up. I got my printed right side face up, and I got the right side of my lining face down, and I'm gonna go ahead and sew that together. Okay, the facing has been stitched to the self fabric. We made a seam because we sewed 2 pieces of fabrics. Eventually, you know, it's gonna get flipped under, just like the other sample. But before we do that, we need to clip our curves. always, always, whenever you have curves, go ahead and clip that seam allowance so that the fabric can just spread and lay nicely. So simple, easy thing to do. Okay, so now the next part of the assignment is to sew the understitch. The understitch means we're gonna sew all of the seam allowance to the facing. Okay, and it's usually best to sew it this side up. And again, we're sewing a stitch on the facing and it's gonna catch all the seam allowance. It's not gonna catch the self fabric at all. Okay, so here I go. I'm gonna put in my pins. So I'm catching the seam allowance because I'm gonna sew through all of that. Okay, so now to do the top stitch, I'm gonna sew a stitch again on the facing, but that stitch is gonna catch the seam allowance underneath it. Okay, all the way around. So here I go. Okay, so I took it out of the machine. We can clip off our loose or our ends of the thread, trim that off. Okay. And again, let's examine this. Yep, we have our understitch sewn on the facing. It's catching the seam allowance. Yeah. And then now we just kind of rolls back, and it really just rolls back so much easier. And we'll take it to the iron, give it a good press. Just using my fingers right now, but you do really want to take this to the iron, flatten it out. And why don't we just compare the two, why we have it. These are our two samples. Let's see, let me put them like this. Do you see a difference? You really should not see a difference. They should look exactly the same on the front. And then we flip it over. This one I still need to press. On the inside, they both have the understitch, but one is fully lined and one has a facing. So that's basically the difference, is fully lined versus facing. Both samples have the understitch technique. All right, guys, let me know how it goes for you.